What if the very first murder in human history had never taken place? What if Cain had not lifted his hand against his brother Abel? Would the destiny of humanity, the rise of nations, the spread of violence, the endless cycle of vengeance, have been different? Could we be living in a world where peace, instead of bloodshed, define the human story? It is a question both haunting and provocative, because it forces us to imagine that the entire course of civilization might rest on a single choice, made by one man, in the earliest days east of Eden. But here lies a startling thought: Abel's survival might not have simply been the continuation of one man's life. His existence carried the seed of a different future, a potential lineage untainted by envy and rebellion, a possibility of a priestly line that would have walked with God in purity. When Abel fell, the possibility of that line fell with him. And with his death, Cain's path, the path of jealousy, violence, and estrangement, became the path that much of mankind would follow. And yet, here is the mysterious connection. The Bible tells us that the earth itself opened its mouth to drink the blood of Abel, and from that moment the ground was cursed. But imagine a world where that soil had never been stained, where humanity's first steps outside Eden were not marked by hatred but by brotherhood, not by bloodshed but by sacrifice. In this shadowed possibility, we glimpse a parallel history, one that could have existed but was forever lost. The story begins with two brothers who brought their offerings before the Lord. Cain, the firstborn of Adam and Eve, offered from the fruit of the ground, the crops of his labor. Abel, his younger brother, brought from the firstborn of his flock, the fat portions, the best of what he had. The text of Genesis tells us that the Lord looked with favor upon Abel and his offering, but not upon Cain's. Why? Generations of scholars have debated this. Was it that God desired blood sacrifice rather than produce from the field? Was it that Abel gave with faith and Cain without? Or was it that the heart behind the gift mattered more than the gift itself? Whatever the reason, the result was devastating. Cain's face fell, and jealousy burned within him. God warned Cain, "Sin is crouching at your door, it desires to have you, but you must rule over it." It was a moment of decision, a divine pause where Cain had the chance to choose a different path. But instead of mastering his jealousy, Cain let it master him. He lured Abel into the field, and there, in the open, committed the unthinkable. He struck down his brother. The first murder, the first shedding of human blood, had stained the ground. Yet here's where our question returns. What if Cain had resisted? What if, instead of succumbing to envy, he had chosen to love his brother, to learn from him, even to grow alongside him? What if Abel had lived? Consider this: Abel was not just a shepherd. He was, in many traditions, seen as the first priest of humanity, offering acceptable sacrifice before God. His life might have represented the continuation of a holy order, a direct line of communion between man and the divine. If Abel had lived, his descendants might have preserved a legacy of righteousness, passing down knowledge of worship and sacrifice that pleased God. Instead, the mantle of the chosen seed shifted later to Seth, the son born after Abel's death. Seth became the forefather of Noah, through whom the world was saved from the flood. But Abel's lineage, what might it have looked like? Would it have changed the story of humanity before the flood? If Abel had lived, perhaps the violence that spread through Cain's descendants, the building of cities, the rise of weapons, the birth of endless vengeance, might never have gained such dominance. Cain's line became known for innovation, yes, but also for rebellion. His descendants gave rise to Lamech, who boasted of killing a man and claimed vengeance 77 times greater than Cain's. Violence multiplied from that first murder, echoing through generations, until the entire earth was filled with bloodshed, forcing God to bring the flood as judgment. But imagine if Abel's line had stood as a counterbalance from the beginning. A family rooted in faith, sacrifice, and obedience, growing alongside Cain's restless builders. Might humanity have leaned more toward worship than war? Could Abel's priestly order have prevented the corruption that spread so quickly? It is as though in Abel's blood lay a possibility for a different humanity, one that was lost forever in a single act of violence. There is a mystery here, too. The book of Hebrews tells us that Abel's blood still speaks, crying out from the ground even after his death. What does it cry? It cries for justice, for remembrance, for a world that might have been. Abel's blood was the first innocent bloodshed, but it was not the last. From that moment onward, the earth became a witness to countless murders, wars, and betrayals. Humanity's story became drenched in the same crimson pattern Cain had begun. And yet, if Abel had lived, that cry might never have been necessary. Perhaps instead of blood crying out, songs of worship would have filled the earth. Think of how different the story of Eden's children might have been. Cain, the farmer, could have learned patience from Abel, the shepherd. The two vocations, the soil and the flock, could have coexisted, working together to provide for humanity's growth. Instead of rivalry, cooperation could have defined the legacy of Adam and Eve's children. Instead of exile, perhaps Cain and Abel together would have carried forward a vision of unity that reflected the lost paradise. And yet we must face the sobering truth: history did not unfold this way. Cain killed Abel, and Abel's blood became a symbol of all innocent suffering. Humanity's story turned toward violence, and the earth became corrupted. But this is why the question remains so powerful, because it forces us to confront not only what happened, but what could have been. If Abel had lived, would there have been a flood at all? Would humanity have descended so deeply into corruption that judgment became inevitable? If Abel's priestly line had preserved righteousness, perhaps the flood might not have been needed. Perhaps mankind would have remained closer to God, and the cycle of destruction might have been broken. This brings us to today. We live in a world still haunted by Cain's choice. Jealousy, rivalry, and violence continue to shape human history. Every war, every act of hatred, every betrayal can be traced back to that first field where brother rose against brother. We are, in a sense, still living in the shadow of Cain's act. But what if we could step into the other story, the story where Abel lived? What lessons would it teach us about how to live now? Perhaps the lesson is this: humanity always has a choice. Cain was warned, and he could have resisted. We too are warned when envy and anger creep into our hearts. The story of Cain and Abel is not only about what was lost, but also about what might still be redeemed. For while Abel's blood cries out for justice, another blood, the blood of Christ, speaks a better word, offering forgiveness where Cain gave only violence. If Cain had never lifted his hand against Abel, history as we know it might look unrecognizably different. The story of the first murder is more than just a tragedy, it is the foundation stone of how humanity understood sin, rivalry, and the weight of blood on the ground. But to imagine a world where Abel lived is to open a doorway into an alternate Eden, a parallel history where mercy triumphed over jealousy. Cain and Abel would not stand as symbols of guilt and innocence, but as partners, brothers walking together beyond the gates of Eden. And in this fragile speculation lies a mystery. Would humanity have escaped the curse of violence, or would another form of corruption have still found its way into the hearts of men? Abel's life was one of sacrifice and devotion. His offering was pleasing because it mirrored obedience, an echo of trust in the divine. If Cain had not killed him, Abel's line might have become a priestly path, a lineage dedicated to the altar rather than the plow. Generations of Abel's descendants could have preserved a world where worship was central, where mankind's first great family was united not by rivalry but by shared reverence. Cain, the worker of the soil, might have partnered with Abel, the keeper of sheep, blending fruit of the ground and flocks of the field into a harmony of gifts. Together, they might have embodied the original design of Eden, man working the earth, man tending the creatures, both in service to God. In such a vision, cities might have been built differently. Instead of rising as monuments to human pride and conquest, they could have been sanctuaries, places of worship, echoes of the garden lost. If Abel's spirit of offering had been multiplied across generations, the first civilizations may not have been dominated by weapons, towers, and kingship, but by altars, sacred festivals, and a rhythm of peace. The earth itself, which groaned beneath the weight of Abel's spilled blood, might have flourished in a gentler balance, for the curse of violence would not have soaked its soil so early. But there is another angle to consider. Abel, though righteous, was mortal. His survival may not have erased the presence of sin, only delayed its eruption. If jealousy had not taken root in Cain, would it have found another vessel? Perhaps Abel's children, too, would have known envy. Perhaps their prosperity would have stirred resentment in Cain's line. And if not Cain, then another son of Adam and Eve might have carried the same restless seed of pride. For sin is not limited to one man, it entered the human story the moment Eden's gates closed. Abel's life would not have meant the end of corruption, but maybe its face would have looked different. The first murder could have been postponed, reshaped, or even magnified in another age. Yet the symbolism remains profound. Abel represents the first victim of violence, the first innocent whose blood cried out from the earth. To erase that cry is to alter the entire thread of Scripture. The prophets, who later spoke of justice in the shedding of blood, would have looked to another beginning. Even the story of Christ, whose sacrifice is often compared to Abel's, would carry a different echo. If Abel had lived, would humanity still have needed to understand the depth of blood guilt? Or would another lesson, one less violent, have set the stage for redemption? Imagine Abel not as a murdered shepherd but as the first elder, the first patriarch of worship. His tent would have been a gathering place of sacrifice, his children the first priests of humanity. Cain, still restless, might have wandered but not as a fugitive. He might have become a builder without the mark of a curse, shaping towns without the shadow of blood. Together, their descendants might have mingled, weaving a human story that began not in bloodshed but in coexistence. Perhaps the Great Flood, which came to cleanse a world consumed by corruption, would not have been necessary, or at least not in the same way. For if violence had not taken root so early, mankind might have walked a slower path toward rebellion. Still, history suggests that humanity carries within it an inescapable flaw. Even without Cain's crime, greed and pride would likely have blossomed elsewhere. Abel might have become a symbol of devotion, but another figure could have become the first murderer. The names would be different, but the shadow would remain. And yet, the delay itself could have changed everything. What if violence had erupted centuries later, after culture had already been shaped by Abel's worshipful lineage? What if mankind had first learned the language of peace before the language of blood? The memory of Abel's living example could have created a legacy so strong that when violence finally appeared, it would have been seen not as normal, but as monstrous, an aberration instead of a foundation. This possibility touches the very heart of humanity's struggle. Are we doomed by our first mistakes, or can alternate choices reshape destiny? Cain's act became the archetype of fratricide, the reminder that jealousy destroys brotherhood. But if Abel had lived, perhaps our collective memory would have been framed not by betrayal, but by reconciliation. The very idea of brotherhood might have carried a sacred weight, a bond unbroken in the first family. Instead of seeing one brother as cursed and the other as dead, we would see two brothers as co-heirs, two branches of humanity starting together, not apart. In this alternate path, the lessons of Eden might have lingered longer. Adam and Eve, watching their sons walk in unity, could have seen a reflection of the paradise they lost. Their grief would have been softened by hope, and the generations after them would not carry the trauma of the first murder. Humanity's relationship with God, fractured but not yet bloodstained, might have remained more tender, more open to reconciliation. Even the concept of sacrifice might have evolved differently, not as a constant echo of death, but as an act of thanksgiving. The altar would not always be a place of blood, but a place of shared offering. Of course, such a vision is speculative, yet it stirs a haunting question: how much of our history is written by violence, and how different would our story be if peace had been the seed instead? Abel's survival would not have erased sin, but it could have redefined the human imagination. Instead of believing that the world begins in betrayal, we might have believed that it begins in cooperation. And that belief could have shaped not only myth and scripture, but the very way civilizations rose, fell, and remembered. If Abel had never fallen to Cain's jealousy, perhaps humanity's first legacy would have been one of peace instead of violence. Yet even in imagining this alternate history, we are forced to confront the deeper truth: sin had already entered the world. Whether through Cain, Abel, or another child of Adam and Eve, the shadow of rebellion was destined to surface. The real question is not whether violence could have been avoided forever, but how long it might have been delayed, and what that delay could have meant for us all. Without Abel's murder, the story of humanity's beginnings might have carried a very different rhythm. Instead of learning that blood cries out from the ground, mankind might have first learned that brotherhood is sacred. The very foundations of civilization could have been shaped by unity, not betrayal. Generations might have looked back to Abel not as the first victim, but as the first teacher of worship, the first patriarch of peace. His descendants might have taught mankind to see the altar as a place of thanksgiving, not tragedy. Cain's wandering would not have been marked by shame, but by the restless call to build and cultivate a different kind of legacy. And yet, perhaps the tragedy of Abel's death has always been part of humanity's story because it reveals something essential: the cost of jealousy, the danger of pride, the endless struggle between love and rivalry. If Abel had lived, our world might look gentler, but the core struggle within the human heart would remain unchanged. For what Cain carried in his heart is what we all carry: the temptation to choose self over brother, desire over humility. Abel's blood still speaks, not only of what was lost but of what might have been. His silence reminds us that the path not taken can be as powerful as the one written in history. And so we are left with the haunting question: if humanity's first steps had not been stained by violence, would we have been closer to Eden, or would another shadow have risen to take its place?